Okay, perfect. Thank you so much.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here today. I'm pinch hitting for John Mann today on today's presentation, but I want to thank you for joining this week's educational lecture series, Latin American Labor and Migration Conditions Week. We're fortunate to have Giada Ferrucci joining us today, not from Lakeside, from a distant country north of us. Ferrucci is a PhD candidate in media studies at Western University in London, Ontario. She holds a bachelor's degree in economic development and international cooperation from the University of Florence, Italy, and a master's degree in international relations from Aarhus University in Denmark, where she focused on the human right to water. Today's presentation, as you can see, is entitled Engage Solidarity, Tracing the Impacts of U.S. Citizen Activism in Central America. In this presentation, Ferrucci will delve into how historical models of solidarity among U.S. citizens persist, remain relevant, and continue to evolve in the defense of human rights, both within and beyond their borders. Giada, could you switch just briefly to your photo so we can at least see your lovely face as we acknowledge who we're speaking with today? And while she's doing that, I'd also ask you to silence your cell phones for the presentation. There will be time, as usual, for Q&A following the presentation. Well, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Giada Ferrucci.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, and good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm Giada Ferrucci, as it was already said, at this point, a recent graduate of the Media Studies program at the University of Western Ontario in Canada, and I'm excited to discuss a topic of great historical and current relevance, solidarity, especially cross-border solidarity. Today, in this 90-minute presentation, I will attempt to delve into the impact of U.S. citizen activism in Central America. More specifically, I will focus on how grassroots efforts have shaped U.S. policies and bolstered the human rights movements in Guatemala and El Salvador, two countries that I've studied a lot throughout my dissertation, especially in terms of mining conflicts. But again, solidarity efforts have been really important in both countries since the mid-70s, thanks to the proactive activism of many US citizens. So since those decades, the 70s, Central American residents in the US have actively mobilized to oppose detrimental policies affecting Central American region. Through organizing delegations, observing firsthand impacts of military and paramilitary operations, they have documented human rights violations and effectively communicated these issues to policymakers and the public alike. Their efforts, supported by other American citizens, encompassed writing letters to representatives, contributing to local media, dispelling misinformation, and amplifying local empowerment movements. The solidarity efforts are particularly intriguing as they illustrate Americans collaborated directly with local communities, responding to their calls for aid rather than imposing external assessment of needs. So today we'll explore the historical context of U.S. foreign policy in Central America, but also considering, more current updates, examine case studies of solidarity efforts, and discuss how these movements have evolved over time to defend human rights, both locally and globally. And so without further ado, I want to share a general overview of the main points of my talk today. So to guide our discussion today, let's take a look at this very concise outline. I'll begin by emphasizing the importance of citizen activism and why it matters in the context of Central American human rights movements. Next, we'll delve into the historical context on how activism emerged and evolved during this period. We will then explore detailed case studies of solidarity efforts in Guatemala and El Salvador. And of course, there are other countries of interest in Central America, including Nicaragua, but for the purpose of this talk and considering my expertise, I decided to focus on these two particular countries, Guatemala and El Salvador, highlighting the specific action taken by activists in the past, but that still continue to have an impact even today. After that, I will examine the methods and strategies these activists employed to challenge US foreign policy and support local empowerment. Finally, we'll have some time for a discussion in terms of the long term impacts of these movements and how they continue to evolve in the fight for human rights even today. Yes, of course. Thank you so much for letting me know. Okay, so let's begin by talking about the importance of citizen activism, which empowers individuals and communities to drive social, political, and even environmental change. It holds entities accountable, promotes justice, and often leads to significant reforms. Historically, activism has shaped major movements and continues to adapt with digital tools, expanding its reach and impact in addressing societal issues. So, some questions that we'll answer today are, for example, how have US citizen activism and grassroots efforts influenced US policies and human rights movements in Guatemala and El Salvador since the mid 1970s? Or another question, what strategies have Central American residents in the US used to mobilize against detrimental US policies, and how have these efforts evolved over time? And finally, another question that I would like to approach and address through the presentation today will be what lessons can be learned from historical solidarity movements in Central America for current and future human rights advocacy. So just doing a simple exercise of a word cloud, which you can see in the picture here presented in the slide, we see that this word cloud encapsulates the key themes and concepts often associated with citizen activism in the context of our discussion in particular. So as you can see, the size of each word reflects its frequency and significance in the discourse on grassroots efforts and human rights movements within the context of solidarity work. So before actually diving in the case studies, Guatemala and El Salvador, I want to spend a bit of time on what I believe are the salient points of the main keywords that define citizen activism. So, for example, we have solidarity, which represents the unity and mutual support within the activist community and between activists and local communities. Then we have empowerment, which highlights the focus on strengthening local capacities and voices. Continuing, we identify human rights. Central to activism efforts, they focus on defending and promoting fundamental rights and freedoms. Another important element in the discussion on citizen activism would be mobilization, which refers to the process of rallying people and resources to support a cause. Awareness is also of key importance, which indicates efforts to inform and educate the public and policymakers about the issues at hand, something that it might have become easier with the decades and technological improvement, but also we know that more and more we face issues of misinformation or disinformation, and so we have to be even more aware about the kind of information that is disseminated across borders. Advocacy, it's also another key element in this discussion, which is the act of arguing in favor of or supporting a particular cause or policy. And finally, I want to take this word cloud as an example and as a element of connection to the topic we'll discuss today, because this word cloud visually represents the multifaceted nature of citizen activism and its critical components. It serves, as you can see, as a very simple visual tool to understand the diverse aspects of activism that we'll explore in detail throughout the presentation and that I'm sure most of you are very familiar with. But again, there are many, many other elements. So I just chose a few to highlight for the purpose of our discussion today. So let's continue. And what do we see over here? A very simple definition of citizen activism, which refers to the efforts by individuals and groups to promote, impede, direct, or intervene in social, political, economic, or environmental reforms. These actions are often driven by the desire to enact change outside of traditional political institutions. So, connecting to the topic discussed today, in the context of Central American human rights movements, citizen activism has played a crucial role, whereas efforts by US citizens and Central American exiles, for example, have significantly influenced US policies and supported local human rights initiatives in Guatemala and El Salvador. And I'm gonna, of course, dive in more a more detailed explanation in a few minutes. This activism also has been pivotal in raising awareness, something that I discussed before, mobilizing resources and applying pressure on policymakers to address human rights abuses. So, in terms of relevance, understanding the importance of citizen activism help us appreciate how ordinary individuals can drive significant social and political change. Finally, it also underscores the power of collective action in confronting injustices and advocating for the rights of marginalized communities. As you can see over here, I'm indicating a few features of citizen activism, which again will highlight in the context of the Central American region and the citizen activism promoted by both US citizens and also Central American citizens residing in United States. And so one of the first features I wish to highlight is the element of grassroots mobilization and impact, which often translate into local empowerment, with citizen activism empowering local communities by amplifying their voices and addressing their specific needs. Activists engage directly, for example, with Central American communities to report on human rights abuses and advocate for policy changes. But once again, public awareness is a very important element of this point over here. Number one, because through grassroots campaigns, media contributions, and public forums, activists raised awareness about the realities of US policies and their impacts on Central America. This helped counter misinformation and highlighted the human cost of interventionist policies. A second element of key importance is the influencing on US policies and legislation. So when we talk about policy shift, we do mention the idea that activism played a crucial role in influencing US foreign policy. Efforts led to significant legislative changes, such as the Boland Amendment, which I'll describe a little more in length later. But basically, this amendment, as I'm sure most of you are familiar with, restricted military aid to repressive regimes and insurgent groups in Central America, and this particular amendment was approved in 1980. And another element in terms of policy and legislation would, of course, be the congressional pressure. Activists successfully lobbied Congress, prompt hearings, investigation into human rights violation, and US involvement in Central America, El Salvador and Guatemala in this case. And so this type of pressure is really strategic as it increases scrutiny, which help limit the effectiveness of interventionist policies. Another element of citizen activism that is also crucial to mention concern the dimensions of advocacy and legislative achievements. So citizen activism directly contributed to the creation of a human rights legislation and policies aimed at curbing US support for oppressive regimes, and activist efforts are also instrumental in passing laws that restricted aid to countries with documented human rights abuses. So beyond legislative action, it's also important to mention the increased oversight, as activism can help lead to increased oversight of US foreign aid and military interventions, promoting greater accountability and transparency in US foreign policy. As we're moving on, we have the fourth dimension, the legacy and continued relevance, something that is really important in terms of how it inspires modern movements for human rights, but also to discuss in terms of how methods of activism are evolving. And so the principle and methods of past citizen activism continue to inspire contemporary human rights movements. The emphasis on direct support and collaboration with local empowerment remains central to modern advocacy efforts, and activists have adapted their strategies to new technologies and global contexts, demonstrating the evolving nature of grassroots mobilization. The lesson learned from historical activism inform current approaches to the global advocacy and policy change. And finally, addressing systemic issues, where here I will focus on strategic solidarity as well as countering neoliberalism, by which I mean that citizen activism highlighted the need for strategic solidarity, linking immediate actions with broader political and systemic goals. And this approach ensures that solidarity efforts contribute to long term transformative change rather than merely addressing isolated crises. And it's also, of course, important to be aware of the historical context with the shift to neoliberal policies and decline of left-wing influence and how it has impacted international solidarity efforts. Reviving and adapting activist strategies indeed is crucial to address contemporary challenges and advancing an equitable global order. So, since the 1970s, the US has been involved in Central America through political and military interventions, often supporting at times authoritarian regimes and counterinsurgency efforts during the Cold War. So, we know that El Salvador and Guatemala lived through incredible violence and repression in these countries that also led to many human rights abuses. And so the active response has emerged from American citizens, focusing on highlighting these abuses, advocating for policy changes, and challenging also US foreign policies that supported oppressive regimes. And so in terms of the historiographical context that we're working with, historical scholarship on US involvement and activism reveals also the complexities of Cold War geopolitics and the significant role of grassroots movements in influencing policy and we're raising awareness about human rights issues. So, in terms of studying activism, so the scholarly examination, historian, historians and scholars study Central America solidarity activism as part of a broader trend, examining the role of non state actors in influencing state policies, and they also focus on opposition, meaning that the field has increasingly focused on those opposing US Cold War policies and their impact on international relations. And in the case study we're working with, especially focusing on the Central American region and the decades from 1960s to 1980s, but of course also the 90s as that defines the peace accords in both countries, Guatemala and El Salvador, and the beginning of the post-war reconstruction. It's important to highlight also social and political inequalities. Central America, in fact, faced significant social, economic, and political inequalities, which spurred various movements for change influenced by the Cuban Revolution and liberation theology. And so, discussing more closely the origins of activism, it's interesting to think about it as a continuation from the 1960s activism. Activism in the 1980s, in fact, was seen oftentimes as a continuation of 1960s movement, challenging the notion that radical activism ended with the 1960s. Actually, it continued, but there were a few differences from anti-war movement. Central American activism, in fact, the one focused on bringing support and denouncing human rights violations in Guatemala and El Salvador, involved significant participation from Central American exiles and established a support network with North American, differing from earlier anti-war movements. Of course, it's also important to mention a few historical precedents. For example, the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, which was formed in the United States in 1960 to advocate for normalized relations with Cuba and oppose US policies toward Fidel Castro's government. It attracted support from intellectuals, activists, and celebrities who opposed US interventions in Cuba's affairs. There's also the Venceremos Brigade as an example of historical precedent, which was established in 1969 as a volunteer organization in the United States, sending American citizens to Cuba to support the Cuban Revolution through voluntary work and solidarity. It aimed to challenge US policies toward Cuba and build bridges of solidarity between the two countries. Another example of historical precedent, following the overthrow of Salvador Allende in Chile in 1973 and due to ongoing US interventions in Latin America, Chilean and Puerto Rican activists in the US mobilized to protest against US foreign policy and support movements for social justice and human rights in their homelands. This activism was part of a broader effort to oppose US imperialism and support Latin American liberation movements. And these movements reflected also transnational solidarity, efforts, and activism among diaspora communities in the United States during critical moments in Latin American history. And as I just mentioned, liberation movement, of course, we cannot forget church-based activism, particularly when we discuss the impact of liberation theology, which emerged in the 1960s, emphasizing social justice, human rights, and the struggle against systemic oppression. Influenced by this theological perspective, many US missionaries and church activists became critical of US Cold War policies, particularly those supporting authoritarian regimes in Latin America. They advocated for a revaluation of US foreign policy and pushed for greater solidarity with Latin American social movements. This activism sought to align religious principles with political actions, challenging both the moral and ethical implications of US policies. And of course, there are a few examples that are really key to mention concerning organizational efforts, such as the North American Congress on Latin America, which was founded in 1966 and is known by its acronym NACLA, and aimed to provide accurate and comprehensive information about Latin American social and political issues. It played a crucial role in educating the public and policymakers about US interventions. And another example would be the Emergency Coalition to Save Central America, EPICA, which was established in the 1980s. And it focused on mobilizing grassroots support and influencing US policy to address the human rights crisis in Central America. It organized campaigns and advocacy efforts to raise awareness and support for Central American refugees. And finally, we have the Washington Office on Latin America, and these are again just some of the many examples, which was founded in 1974, a leading advocacy organization working on human rights and social justice issues in Latin America. It conducts research, develops policy recommendations, and engages in advocacy to influence US foreign policy and support human rights in the region. And as one last aspect, again talking about legislative support, in response to the growing awareness and activism, the US Congress began focusing more on human rights issues in the 70s and 80s, leading to the enactment of legislation that restricted US aid to countries known for human rights abuses. For example, the Foreign Assistance Act of 1961 was amended to include provisions aimed at promoting human rights and limiting assistance to oppressive regimes. Additionally, the creation of the Office of Human Rights in the State Department in 1977 marked a formal commitment to addressing human rights concerns within US foreign policy. I mentioned before also congressional hearings, which were used to investigate human rights violations and scrutinize US policies in Central America. These hearings aim to bring attention to the abuses occurring in the region and hold the US government accountable for its foreign policy decisions. They provided a platform for activism, but also witnesses and experts to present evidence of human rights violation and advocate for policy changes. And notable examples include the hearings led by Senator Tom Harkin and Representative Edward Markey, which focused on the impact of USAID and policies on human rights countries in countries like El Salvador and Guatemala. So a bit of a recap of what we discussed until now. Since the 1970s, US involvement in Central America has been characterized by a series of military and political interventions. And at times, this has translated in providing substantial military and economic aid to authoritarian regimes in countries like Guatemala and El Salvador. And the government of these regimes were often engaged in brutal repression of dissent, leading to widespread human rights abuses. and also backing insurgent groups. In case where existing regimes were deemed insufficiently anti-communist, the US tended to support insurgent groups. A notable example is the Contra rebels in Nicaragua, another Central American country who lived through violent decades in the second half of the previous century and who unfortunately continue to do so, and where this group, the Contra rebels, were funded and trained to overthrow the Sandinista government. And in terms of military aid and training, the US also supplied weapons, military training, and logistically support, including the notorious School of the Americas, where many Latin American military officers received training that they later used in counterinsurgency operations. So it's also important to, of course, mention economic and strategic interests as driving factor. And Central America indeed is seen as a valuable region for economic interest, including access to natural resources and agricultural products. The regional strategic location also made it an important transit route for global trade. There was also attempt to prevent the spread of Soviet influence in Latin America. The fear was that if one country fell under communist control, others in the region would follow, a theory known as the domino effect. And in terms of economic policies, US economic policies in the region often favored American corporations and investors, sometimes at the expense of local economies and populations. And many reforms promoted free market policies, privatization, deregulation. And one last element I would like to highlight is also the strategic military presence in Central America, which was seen as crucial for US strategic interest, including military bases, training facilities, alliances also to ensure regional stability aligned with the US interest. By understanding these facets of US involvement, we can better appreciate the complex dynamics that have shaped US Central American relations and the profound impact that these policies have had on the region's political and social landscape. So, the intervention previously mentioned not only influenced the course of conflicts in Central America, but also had lasting implications for human rights and the development in the region. So the imperial aggression has been contested for over a century, with solidarity movement often reactive to visible aggressive intervention, and US anti-imperialism evolved from exclusionary mainstream models to radical approaches promoting international solidarity with Latin American allies. And solidarity movements typically responded to instances of overt US military and political intervention, which affected and also attracted significant public and activist attention. In terms of challenges and evolution, US solidarity efforts also faced challenges related to ideological inconsistencies and opposition from dominant political economic forces. But of course, even when it comes to solidarity, there are many challenges to sustain it. The intensity of solidarity effort is often linked to the visibility of interventions, and so immediate moral outrage can drive strong reactions, but sustaining activism long term can be challenging. Maintaining momentum in solidarity efforts require transitioning from a crisis driven response to sustained strategic engagement. In terms of short-term response and strategic versus crisis-driven politics, immediate crisis responses, while important, may not always contribute to long-term political transformation, and effective solidarity should integrate short-term actions into broader, long-term political goals to drive systemic change. And so here we're already approaching core questions for solidarity. It is crucial, in fact, to link short term actions against specific instances of empire to broader anti imperial and anti capitalist struggles. And in recognizing US imperialism as a part of a larger capitalist expansion project, it also helps frame solidarity efforts within a global context. Continuing discussing also these efforts focused on opposing formal military interventions, these also laid the groundwork for future solidarity movements, and early 20th century radicals conducted specific struggles toward their anti capitalist objectives. And because again we're considering a very specific historical context, of course the impact of World War II and Cold War significantly disrupted and diminished the influence of the US left, and during this period, human rights activists emerged to fill the void, focusing on addressing abuses, human rights abuses, rather than systemic issues. And finally, focus on immediate crisis. Human rights focused solidarity often emphasized immediate crisis and adopted professional legal approaches, which could lead to a cycle of moving from one crisis to another without long-term strategy. And so, with the efforts, the military and political support, and the widespread abuses that I described so far, that I will keep mentioning a little more in terms of violations by military and paramilitary forces in Guatemala and El Salvador, this caused a public outcry, growing awareness and outrage over what was happening in Central America, and a moral responsibility and motivation for activism, where many use as citizens felt a duty to oppose their government harmful policies and express solidarity with victims, desire to support the Central American communities suffering from violence and repression, and finally providing information and advocacy at once. Activists, in fact, aim to document abuses and raise awareness of what was happening in Central America at the time. So here we are discussing the factors that drove US citizen activism, leading to significant grassroots efforts to support human rights and challenge policy in Guatemala and El Salvador that were causing those human rights violations in the first place. So today, as we know already, my focus is going to be in those two particular countries, Guatemala and El Salvador. So I apologize for the slide, which is kind of text dense, but it's basically to provide a coincide overview of these tumultuous decades, starting with Guatemala, where in 1950s we witnessed a dramatic shift in the political landscape, most notably with the US-backed coup in 1954 that ousted the democratically elected president Jacobo Arbenz. This coup set the stage for decades of military rule and political repression. The subsequent decades, particularly the 60s and 70s, were characterized by intense guerrilla warfare as various leftist groups sought to challenge the government. Government response was brutal, leading to widespread human rights abuses and significant loss of life. The 1980s saw the conflict reach its peak, with the Guatemalan military engaging in severe repression and violence against not only guerrilla fighters, but also indigenous communities, culminating in what has been recognized as acts of genocide. Despite international condemnation, support persisted due to Cold War dynamics by the government of the US at the time, and it wasn't until the 1990s that the conflict began to wind down, ultimately leading to the signing of the peace accord in 1996, which formally ended the 36-year civil war, though the country faced lingering challenges of social and economic inequality and the need for reconciliation and justice for past atrocity. El Salvador journey shares some features compared to Guatemala's story, and through these decades, similarly began with political instability. The 1950s and 60s were marked by a series of military coups as authoritarian regimes to control and suppress political dissent in the country. By the 1970s, socioeconomic inequality and political repression have fueled the rise of leftist guerrilla movements, leading to a full-scale civil war by the end of the decade. The 1980s were a particularly brutal period in El Salvador, with the civil war intensifying and the government, supported by US military aid, engaging in widespread human rights violations. The infamous El Mozote massacre, where nearly 1,000 civilians were killed by the Salvadoran army, exemplified the level of violence and brutality experienced during this time. Despite these atrocities, the conflict persisted into the early 1990s. A shift began with the initiation of peace talks and the signing of the peace accord in 1992, which brought an end to the 12-year civil war. paving the way for democratization and attempts at national reconciliation. However, like Guatemala, El Salvador faced significant challenges in addressing the legacy of conflict, including economic recovery, justice for human rights abuses, and establishment of a stable and inclusive political system. These complex and balanced histories, both in Guatemala and El Salvador, illustrate the profound impact of US foreign policy in the region, but also of citizen activism, because these decades were marked by brutal conflict and significant human suffering, driving US citizen activism aimed at supporting human rights and challenging documenting abuses, raising awareness, and advocating for policy changes, highlighting the power and importance of cross border solidarity in the face of injustice. Focusing a little more closely on the civil war in Guatemala, spanning from 1960 to 1996, it was a protracted conflict marked by intense guerrilla warfare and severe government repression, as I mentioned before. And the war began again after a US backed coup in 1954, which ousted President Jacobo Arbenz. And the conflict ended with the signing of the peace accords in 1996. But again, this particular civil war is also well known, unfortunately, for the genocide against the indigenous population. And so, to understand the context of US citizen activism in Guatemala, it is essential to also examine the historical events that shaped the region's political landscape and human rights situation. The two pivotal moments that had a profound impact in this context are highlighted here and already mentioned the orchestrated coup in 1954, but also the aftermath, which led to decades of military rule characterized by widespread human rights abuses and violence. And the Guatemalan Civil War, even just the length, is staggering 36 years of atrocities, including massacres of indigenous communities and forced disappearances. So, a little bit of this story is actually represented in this tempera on canvas painting by Mexican artist Diego Rivera, which was painted in 1954. And this painting, La Gloriosa Victoria, Glorious Victory, addresses the 1954 Guatemalan coup d'etat that the Central Intelligence Agency backed to overthrow the democratically elected Guatemalan President Jacobo Arbenz. Just even looking at a few of these figures, the complexity of this story, the intervention of US policies, but also the many people that died. And this was painted in 1954, so even before the beginning of the Civil War, at least officially. And so, if we were to really think about the supporting of amid the violations under the regime of Efraín Rios Montt, who ruled Guatemala from 82 to 83, repression reached a severe peak. The administration by Rios Montt, characterized by its counterinsurgency tactics, engaged in a brutal campaign against suspected guerrilla sympathizers. This period saw widespread human rights violation, and the government implemented scorched earth policies that targeted indigenous communities, which were often accused of supporting guerrilla. These actions led to significant civilian casualties and displacement, exacerbating the humanitarian crisis and leaving a profound impact on Guatemala's social fabric. And so, when I will discuss more in length activist examples in the US supporting Guatemalan citizen struggles, it's really important to be aware of, unfortunately, this very violent history, which again shares some features with the El Salvador Civil War, which lasted from 79 to 1992, a violent conflict between the Salvadoran government and leftist guerrillas, rooted in deep socioeconomic inequalities and political repression. The war began as a guerrilla movement driven by widespread poverty and human rights abuses, clashed with a series of authoritarian regimes in El Salvador. As we know, the US provided military aid, training, and support to the Salvadoran government, aiming to contain and suppress the insurgency and counter communist influence. This support persists despite numerous reports of human rights violations committed by the government of El Salvador, by its forces, by its army, including extrajudicial killings and forced disappearance. The conflict, marked by extreme brutality and human suffering, with around 75,000 victims, formally ended with the peace accords in 1992, which initiated a challenging process of democratization and reconciliation amidst continued social and economic struggle. So, in this fight against leftist guerrillas, that led, of course, as I mentioned before, unfortunately, to significant human rights abuses by both government forces but also by insurgents. And so, human rights violations, as I mentioned before, included instances of massacres as well as forced disappearances, torture, extrajudicial killings were rampant, with many victims subjected to brutal treatment by both military and paramilitary groups. Activists and civilians often suspected of supporting the guerrillas or opposing the government were targeted for violence. The conflict also caused extensive displacement, with many Salvadorans fleeing to escape the pervasive violence and insecurity of their country. And so, once again, this is one of the largest massacres documented in El Salvador during the Civil War conflict. And so here we have a very different examples compared to the majestic artwork by Diego Rivera. This is more of an example of popular art. This war memorial mural is in the town of Nuevo Gualcho in the department of Usulután in El Salvador, a poignant and powerful piece of public art dedicated to commemorating the victims of the Salvadoran Civil War. This mural, as you can see here, serves as both a tribute to those who suffered and a statement of resistance against the violence that plagued the region. So, to understand the context of US citizen activism in El Salvador, it is essential to examine key historical events that shaped the region's political landscape and human rights situation. First, we have the murder of Archbishop Oscar Romero in 1980. And Romero, a prominent critic of government repression, was murdered while celebrating Mass. His assassination drew international outrage and spotlighted the brutal nature of the Salvadoran conflict. Another very sad instance was the murder of American churchwomen in 1980 when four American churchwomen were brutally killed by Salvadoran National Guard forces. This high-profile incident highlighted the extreme violence and human rights abuses occurring in the country, prompting increased international attention and activism. And so, describing grassroots mobilization, Central American diaspora communities and U.S. activists played a crucial role in advocating against U.S. policies and raising awareness about human rights violations as caused by Salvadoran and Guatemalan governments. Their efforts included organizing protests, mobilizing large-scale demonstrations and rallies to raise public awareness and pressure policymakers, lobbying Congress, engaging in direct advocacy to influence legislative decisions and secure support for human rights causes, creating media campaigns, developing and disseminating information through newspapers, radio, and other media to inform the public and amplify their message, and finally, influence on policy, as it's important to highlight the contribution of activism to policy changes, such as the 1980 Boland Amendment. And so, since the 1970s, we know that oftentimes the US foreign policy in Central America has been marked by significant intervention, which might have had also severe repercussions for local populations, leading to social unrest. And so, in the late 1970s and 1980s, activism against this type of policies through solidarity movement became more and more important as thousands in the US engaged in the Central American solidarity movement, opposing the US support for Salvadoran and Guatemalan governments accused of human rights abuses, and the methods that they use are still quite important and quite relevant today, and employ the various strategies, including demonstrations, lobbying, civil disobedience, humanitarian aid, and even direct travel to the region to war-torn communities. And in my work in El Salvador, for example, I've met many Americans who actually still either live or travel to El Salvador, where they started going during the Civil War conflict to provide humanitarian aid, showing a degree of commitment and solidarity that is really incredible. And so, again, in describing US policies during the Cold War as including military aid, financial support, military training, and weaponry, in the combating leftist insurgencies and countering perceived communist threats in El Salvador and Guatemala, unfortunately, we do need to be aware of the fact that, for example, the US government provided millions of dollars in military assistance to the Salvadoran government during the Reagan administration, including training for special forces and counterinsurgency units, arms and equipment for military operations. Economic support is also another element of importance in terms of the inclusion of financial grants and loans used to bolster the economies of these governments in El Salvador and Guatemala while helping them maintain their repressive policies. And finally, it's also important to mention the pro intervention groups, as there were various groups in the US actively supporting interventionist policies in Central America. This included lobbying organizations that advocated for continued military and economic aid, fundraising groups that gathered resources for arms, and private individuals and entities who served to align with Cold War ideologies, pushing for interventions to prevent the spread of socialism and communism in the region. And so, of course, I mentioned before the extrajudicial killings, the forced disappearance, torture, human rights violations, and massacres that unfortunately took place during the civil war conflicts in both Guatemala and El Salvador. And the civilian population, unfortunately, it was the one that bore the brunt of the violence, with significant displacement and suffering resulting from military operations and conflicts, as well as limited effectiveness, because while the solidarity movement did not end US intervention, it succeeded in limiting some of the Reagan administration effectiveness and drawing attention to human rights issues. So, in response to harmful policies, Central American residents and Americans as well in the US began organizing to advocate for change. Diaspora communities formed networks and groups dedicated to raising awareness and influencing US policy. They played a key role in opposing these policies, organizing delegations to report on the impacts of military and paramilitary operations, and this activism was driven by a strong sense of solidarity and commitment to supporting local empowerment movements. So, a few of these examples could include the Committee in Solidarity with the People of El Salvador, CISPES, which is still active today, and also Witness for Peace to advocate for the country and oppose US policies. These groups often collaborated with broader human rights and peace organizations to amplify their impact as part of coalitions. And of course, the solidarity efforts were rooted in collaboration with local movements, focusing on direct responses to local needs rather than external assessments. So, thinking about notable figures in citizen activism, we can think of Jesuit priests, community leaders, community leaders, prominent human rights advocates played key roles in mobilizing support and influencing public opinion. Organizations like CISPES, Witness for Peace, and the Share Foundation were instrumental in organizing protest, educational campaigns, and lobbying efforts. So, describing a little more this organization, for example, the Committee in Solidarity with the People of El Salvador, CISPES, was instrumental in organizing protest and educational campaigns. The organization worked to raise awareness about the human rights abuses in El Salvador and mobilize public support for policy changes. They also played a crucial role in lobbying Congress to restrict US military aid to Salvadoran government forces. Witness for Peace is an organization focused on documenting and publicizing the impact of US foreign policy in Central America. It sent delegations to the region to observe and report on human rights abuses, bringing these issues to the attention of the American public and policymakers through reports, testimonies, and media coverage. And finally, the Share Foundation provided direct support to war-torn communities affected in the region. Again, it's still active today, and it organized fundraising and educational events, supported grassroots projects in the region, and advocated for changes necessary to build solidarity networks. More specifically, for example, in Guatemala, we also have NISGUA, a network in solidarity with the people of Guatemala, founded in 1981. NISGUA focused on raising awareness about human rights abuses in Guatemala and supported justice for victims of the Guatemalan Civil War. Although it played a crucial role in advocating for Guatemala, its prominence was somewhat limited due to the reduction of US military aid to the country in the 1980s, which impacted the group's ability to mobilize resources and influence policy. Another example, once again focused on El Salvador, is the Committee of Progressive Salvadorians, Comité de Salvadoreños Progresistas, CSP, an organization that was instrumental in mobilizing Salvadoran exiles and played a significant role in organizing demonstrations, lobbying for US policy changes, and raising awareness about the brutalities of the Salvadoran Civil War. It served as a vital platform for Salvadoran exiles to voice concerns and influence international opinion. So let's talk more about delegations, for example, to and international observers from organizations such as the International Commission of Jurists, for example, or Amnesty International and also the Human Rights Watch, which all conducted fact-finding missions to Guatemala, for example, in the 1980s. These missions were crucial in documenting widespread human rights abuses, including interviews with survivors, analysis of evidence, and direct observations of the situation. Impact reports were also important as they were generated by these delegations to raise global awareness about the Guatemalan government's human rights violations. For example, the 1983 report by International Commissions of Jurists and Amnesty International 1984 report highlighted the extent of the atrocities and significantly contributed to international pressure on the Guatemalan government and its US supporters. Of course, it's also crucial to mention specific incidents of human rights violations reported. For example, reports detailed horrific incidents such as the Saman massacre in the department of Alta Verapaz in Guatemala in 1982, which targeted indigenous communities. These massacres were part of a broader strategy of terror aimed at suppressing dissent and eliminating perceived guerrilla sympathizers. Reports also documented forced disappearances, including cases where individuals were abducted by security forces and never seen again. These disappearances were part of a systematic campaign to eliminate opposition and instill fear among the population. So in terms of documentation, activists in human rights organizations, as the one I mentioned before, conducted extensive documentation of abuses in Guatemala. Reports from Amnesty International and the International Commission of Jurists included photographic evidence, field observation, and survivor testimonies. And these detailed accounts were crucial in highlighting the scale of the atrocities and contributing to mounting international pressure on the Guatemalan government to address these violations. Further, the Central American diaspora, including Salvadoran and Guatemalan exiles, played a significant role in lobbying US policymakers. Organizations like NISGUA, the Network in Solidarity with People of Guatemala, worked to influence US foreign policy by meeting with legislators, presenting evidence of human rights abuses, and advocating for policy changes. Their lobbying efforts aim to encourage a reassessment of military and economic aid. And finally, public education. Activists in diaspora utilized various platforms to educate the American public and policymakers about the situation in Guatemala. This included organizing public demonstrations, producing media campaigns, and engaging in grassroots organizing. Similarly, in El Salvador, US citizens documented the impact of the Civil War and the abuses committed by both sides. The efforts help to bring international attention to the plight of civilians in El Salvador. So, major delegations kind of followed a little bit the pattern of Guatemala with the involvement of Amnesty International and International Commission of Jurists in conducting fact-finding missions to document the human rights abuses in El Salvador, which provided a clear evidence-based account of the human rights crisis. Campaigns for Justice detailed the findings from these reports, and they were instrumental in launching campaigns for justice, as I said, and policy reform as well. So activists and human rights organizations use these reports to push for changes internationally and to advocate for a reduction in military aid to El Salvador, push for more stringent conditions on aid that will require improvement in human rights practices. In terms of campaigns to address human rights abuses, activists, including members of the Committee in Solidarity with the People of El Salvador, CISPES, lobbied Congress to curtail military aid to El Salvador. They focused on raising awareness among legislators about the human rights violations committed by Salvadoran forces and argued for a revaluation of US supports. These awareness campaigns also included mass protests, such as the 1981 Washington, D.C. demonstration against U.S. support for the Salvadoran government, educational events like seminars and teachings, media outreach through press conferences, articles, and interviews. Organizations like Witness for Peace and the American Friends Service Committee played a key role in these efforts, aiming to inform and mobilize public opinion to advocate for a shift and finally, increased pressure, as the combined efforts of detailed reporting and public advocacy significantly increased pressure on the Salvadoran government and US policymakers. International attention and public outcry led to greater scrutiny of human rights abuses and contributed to a revaluation of US interventionist policies in the region. So I mentioned a few of these dimensions already, but again, talking about the compilation of detailed reports on human rights abuses as fundamental because these reports were shared with policymakers, media, and the public to highlight the severity of the situation and garner support for intervention. Campaigns for justice included legal efforts and support for victims, as these campaigns were seeking justice for victims, including pushing for investigations into human rights violations and holding perpetrators accountable, to provide also support and resources to survivors and families affected by the violence. Legislative advocacy was happening through lobbying efforts by activists to influence US legislators to reconsider military aid to El Salvador and address the human rights concerns raised by the conflict. Successful advocacy led to policy shifts such as restriction on military aid and increased scrutiny of US involvement in the region. Campaigns were also launched to inform the American public about the human rights abuses occurring in El Salvador, as well as Guatemala, including traditional media channels such as newspapers, radio, and television. And finally, the combined efforts of advocacy, awareness, and lobbying led to increased pressure on the US government to change its policies, reduce support for the Salvadoran government, and also push for growing awareness and contribution to the international condemnation of the human rights abuses committed by the Salvadoran government. So this advocacy and awareness efforts were crucial in highlighting the human rights crisis in El Salvador and influencing both public opinion and foreign policies to address the ongoing support that the US administration was giving at the beginning of the 80s, to denounce the assassination of Archbishop Romero and the US church women, among many other instances of massacres, and finally, leading to the peace accords that were signed in 1992 after significant casualties. So at this point, we're thinking more about beyond the case studies, the methods and strategies that activists use to organize their effort. Delegations, securing fundings through donations, leveraging grassroots support to amplify their message. All these methods were essential in creating a robust an effective advocacy movement, enabling activists to highlight human rights abuses and influence public opinion and government actions. So delegations to document human rights abuses in Central America were frequently organized through grassroots networks. Funding for these missions came from various sources within the community, including the donations from individuals, fundraising events, and contributions from activist organizations. For example, organizations like Witness for Peace and CISPES held benefit concerts, bake sales, and community dinners to raise the necessary funds. Volunteer efforts were also important, as many delegations rely heavily on volunteers who were part of activist communities and organizations. These volunteers often included lawyers, journalists, students, and other concerned citizens willing to dedicate their time and resources to document the human rights violations in El Salvador and Guatemala. Organizations that I previously mentioned, such as Amnesty International and International Commissions of Jurists, recruited volunteers who had relevant expertise and a passion for human rights advocacy. Community meetings, community outreach, of course, were also very important as activists organized local meetings to inform community members about the human rights abuses occurring in Central America. And these meetings served as a platform to share detailed reports, survivor testimonies, and expert analysis, thereby fostering a sense of urgency and commitment to the cause. Rallies and protests, such as the 1981 in Washington, D.C., are also important because they gathered thousands of participants, drawing media attention and amplifying the message of solidarity. Organizations and leveraging social networks, activists use the existing social networks to spread information and mobilize resources. What do I mean by social networks? Religious institutions, for example, cultural organizations, and student groups to reach a broader audience and gather support. In terms of coalition building, something that is really pivotal, activism formed coalitions with diverse groups, which I mentioned before, and these strategies help to pool resources, share information, and coordinate action. For example, the coalition between CISPES and various church groups significantly strengthened their advocacy efforts by launching joint campaigns to increase their impact and combining resources, networks, synchronizing protest actions, and issuing joint public statements. For example, the Sanctuary Movement, a coalition of religious groups that provided shelter to Central American refugees and advocated for their rights, combined legal support with public advocacy and participated in this solidarity effort that also, of course, had an international dimension by collaborating, by establishing a partnership with groups such as Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, which provided additional expertise, resources, and a broader platform for advocacy. And so, increased migration, of course, is also something that was addressed by the solidarity movement as the late 1970s and 80s saw a significant increase in immigration from Central America, driven primarily by escalating violence and political instability. Countries like El Salvador, Guatemala, but also Nicaragua, as we know, experienced severe civil conflicts that forced large numbers of people to flee their homes. And so by 1982, approximately 500,000 Salvadorans had sought refuge in other countries, with heading to the United States. In terms of the U.S. Refugee Act of 1980, this act aimed to standardize the process for admitting refugees into the United States. However, the act's strict definition of persecution excluded many Central Americans fleeing violence. The law prioritized individuals persecuted on specific grounds such as race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. Consequently, many Central Americans who escaped generalized violence and civil war but did not meet these exact criteria were denied refugee status, leaving them without legal protection or support. And as I mentioned before, churches and safe houses, in response to the restrictive U.S. refugee policies and the exclusion of many Central American migrants, The sanctuary movement emerged as a form of grassroots activism. Church and activists across the US began to provide safe houses and other forms of support to Central American refugees. By early 1983, over 200 churches had declared themselves sanctuaries, offering shelter, legal assistance, and advocacy for those fleeing violence. These movements were directly challenged these immigration policies and highlighted moral imperative to provide support, legal support, and advocacy for all these refugees. And so activists worked to raise awareness about the plight of Central American refugees and lobbied for changes in US immigration policies. Legal professionals within the movement provided representation for asylum seekers, challenging deportation orders and advocating for more inclusive definition of persecutions to adhere to international refugee standards. And so, in this context, effective communication was a key. Delegates wrote letters to congressional representatives, contributed opinion to local newspapers, and used public forums to share their findings. This helped counter misinformation and highlight the human cost that was taking place during the civil war conflicts in Guatemala and El Salvador. And so, what were these communication tactics that are still quite relevant today, albeit shifted toward more social media platforms? Activists systemically wrote letters to congressional representatives to advocate for policy changes and highlight human rights abuses in Central America. These letters often detailed the specific incidents of violence and called for legislative action to address the issues. Additionally, activists contributed articles to newspapers using these platforms to inform the public and lawmakers about the gravity of the situation and rally support for policy reforms. Activists also engage with local media through interviews, press releases, and to amplify their message and counteract misinformation. They also participate in public forums, town hall meetings, and community events to educate the public, mobilize support, and build awareness about human rights violations and the need for policy changes. This approach helped to foster a well informed public and increase pressure on policymakers to take action. So, press releases and reports, basically media campaigns, were used to inform the public and policymakers. And organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch regularly publish these documents to increase visibility and awareness. Activists, in fact, frequently appear in interviews on TV, radio, and print media to share personal stories and expert commentary. These media appearances humanized the issues and brought the realities of the conflict to a wider audience, and publications like the New York Times and Washington Post contributed to this cause as they often featured these pieces to sustain public discourse on Central American issues. In terms of public events, public forums and lecture at universities, community centers, and churches educated communities about the conflict in Central America. Experts, eyewitnesses, and refugees were invited to share their experiences and insights. Workshops and teachings also provided in-depth education and practical skills for activism, covering the history of U.S. Central American relations, U.S. foreign aid policies, and effective advocacy techniques. And finally, documentaries that were screened, such as When the Mountains Tremble, about the Guatemalan Civil War, were also important events. Art exhibitions, musical performance, they all engaged and educated the public by highlighting human stories. So, for example, talking about media influence, Penny Lear's new book, Cry of the People, published in 1980, exposed US support for the dictatorial regime in Latin America and highlighted the role of the Catholic Church in defending human rights. International support, as discussed so far, included regional coordination, such as housing, medical care, and counseling for Central American migrants with coordination between US and Canadian border cities. So all these efforts were really important to also discuss the idea of dispelling false narratives through fact-checking, as activists undertook rigorous fact-checking to address and correct misinformation about the situation in Central America. They scrutinized and refuted misleading claims propagated by Proponents of civil war use incredible evidence to highlight the discrepancies between official statements by the Salvadoran and Guatemalan government and the actual conditions on the ground. Activists also work to educate the public and media about the true nature of U.S. involvement in Central America. They organize educational campaigns and briefings to inform people about the real impact of U.S. foreign policy, including the human rights violations and socio-political consequences of military and economic support. Representing clear evidence-based information through reports, documentaries, and public speaking engagements, they aim to foster a more informed and engaged public. And finally, activists also engage with media outlets to ensure that accurate information was reported. They provide journalists with verified data, personal testimonies, and detailed reports to counteract biased or incomplete coverage and provide a more nuanced and truthful portrayal of the situation. And so when we discuss, for example, the long-term impacts and evolution even today, one important element would be, for example, congressional hearings, as I mentioned before, where through these hearings, light was shed on the human rights abuses committed with US support and increased scrutiny of US actions. Testimonies from activists, victims, and experts provided a compelling case for policy changes and held the government accountable for its actions. Shifts in public opinion were also important through persistent advocacy and public education campaigns. And this shift in public sentiment played a crucial role influencing policymakers to demand a change in foreign aid practices, such as the one pushed by the Boland Amendment, which was a direct result of grassroots lobbying, public pressure, and advocacy work of organizations that highlighted the misuse of U.S. aid and its connection the Civil War conflict, and finally, policy evaluation that sustained efforts of activists and that contributed to a broader evaluation of U.S. foreign policy in Central America. So, reconsideration of the ethical implication, and this led to a more cautious and conditional aid policies and a greater emphasis on human rights consideration in foreign policy decisions. And so, overall, the activism of US citizens played a crucial role in shaping US policy, leading to greater accountability, policy reforms, and more nuanced approach to foreign aid and international relations. So here we have some key elements to address in terms of how the Department of Justice, for example, began surveilling and targeting sanctuary movements in 1982, leading to infiltration and indictments, and this crackdown, of course, increased the movement's visibility and support. But also, there are important journalists and historians. Figures like Walter Lafever and John Didion played roles in challenging the US government portrayal of Central American conflicts. And known for his work in moral philosophy, for example, William Talbot has critiqued Cold War era policies, arguing that President Ronald Reagan's arms control proposals were deliberately designed to be rejected by the Soviet Union, thereby undermining genuine negotiations and perpetuating the arms race. His analysis highlighted the strategic use of diplomatic proposals for political maneuvering rather than sincere conflict resolution. And in terms of legacy and influence, again, these ideas provide insights into these foreign policy and strategies and challenges as we were moving on toward the end of the Cold War era. And so, discussing how activism was affecting US foreign policy and legislation at the time, legislative changes, activism led to legislative action such as the previously mentioned Boland Amendment, but also activist pressure contributed to evaluation of US foreign policy in the region and increased scrutiny of military interventions and reduced aid to pressure, thanks to the pressure from activists, leading to a reduction in military aid and increased oversight of US involvement in Central America. So today, the moral solidarity seen in these historical efforts continue to inspire modern human rights movements. These methods have evolved, but the core principles of direct support and collaboration with local empowerment remain central. For example, through ongoing advocacy, the principle and Strategies of the solidarity movement continue to influence contemporary human rights advocacy and international movements. And so lessons learned from past solidarity efforts inform current approaches to global activism and policy advocacy. And in terms of evolution adaptation, activists have adapted their methods to new technologies and global context, continuing to influence human rights advocacy and policy on a global scale. So we're thinking again of this continued relevance and evolution, thinking about this shift to soft power as the end of Cold War saw a shift from overt military interventions to soft powers strategies through economic policies and also arbitrary solidarity. This shift in fact led to more arbitrary solidarity efforts which were at times less effective in addressing systemic issues related to neoliberal policies and linking immediate and long-term goals, it is vital to link on broader political movements to ensure effective and sustainable changes. And a lack of strategic focus in this context, in progressive politics, for example, has limited the potential for transformational changes. At the same time, the decline of left-wing influence and the rise of neoliberalism in the past reduced the state role in supporting working people, impacting international solidarity effort. And so progressive politics shifted away from state-focused struggles, affecting also the effectiveness of international solidarity. As we're still thinking about current conditions and future direction, it's important to mention challenging environment, as the current political environment presents challenges for internationalism due to shifting political dynamics and neoliberal policies, and reviving as well, of course, the connection between liberation struggles across borders and advancing an equitable global order. So again, many of these dimensions were already highlighted as the continued relevance and evolution of activism from Americans toward El Salvador and Guatemala can be understood through key dimensions from the historical context of solidarity that we analyzed today. The work of organizations like the Committee in Solidarity with the People of El Salvador or the Guatemala Human Rights Commission, as they both mobilized public opinion and lobbied Congress against U.S. support for authoritarian regimes in these countries. And as this activism led to increased awareness and pressure on U.S. policies, it also contributed to changes in foreign aid and diplomatic relations. So some of the issues described so far also keep persisting, including economic disparity, corruption, and violence. Activists continue to work on addressing these challenges and supporting marginalized communities in El Salvador and Guatemala as the post-war reconstruction process has not been at all easy nor smooth. And with the rise of also migration from Central America to the US through those migrant caravans we all know about, activists also focus on advocating for human migration policies and providing support for refugees and asylum seekers today, just as they did during the 80s. So, as we continue considering how activism evolved, of course, we are more aware than ever of the presence of digital activism, where social media and digital platforms have transformed how activists mobilize, share information, and build international solidarity through, for example, channels as Twitter, Instagram, WhatsApp, and online campaigns. And digital storytelling play a significant role in raising awareness and influencing public opinion. But of course, activists keep working in partnership with local organizations in El Salvador and Guatemala, emphasizing grassroots approaches and supporting local leadership in addressing issues. And finally, there's been also more importance on intersectional approaches, where modern activism often incorporates intersectional perspectives, addressing how issues like gender, race, sexual orientation, but also environmental justice intersect with struggles in El Salvador and Guatemala. So, as we keep thinking about all these elements and how activism can continue to influence policies pushing for changes that address root causes of violence and human rights violations in Central America rather than just their symptoms, cultural exchanges, educational programs, and collaborative projects still have built deeper understanding and solidarity between American citizens and Central American communities. And so the evolution of activism reflects a shift from perhaps direct intervention and lobbying to today more collaborative and multifaceted approaches. adapting to contemporary challenges while maintaining a commitment to justice and solidarity. So just to end this presentation, thinking about the main points discussed in terms of the role of US and Central American citizen activism in El Salvador and Guatemala during the late 20th century, we uncover some significant impact on human rights and social justice movement, which again is important to understand how this activism was essential in highlighting abuses, mobilizing support, and shaping US policy by examining the historical context and impact, as well as methods and strategies employed, thinking about the legal legacy and relevance of these movements today, as well as how solidarity and the nature of solidarity has evolved over time in response to changing political and social context. Understanding this evolution helps us apply historical insights to address current issues more effectively. And so perhaps I think it's time to open the floor for questions, discussion, points, comment concerning any aspect of the presentation. Also, thoughts on how these historical models of solidarity are still relevant today. And I think this is a good opportunity to delve deeper into any points you found perhaps challenging or intriguing or worth exploring to consider how lessons from past activism might inform our current efforts when we discuss impacts of citizen activism and current global human rights issues, but also reflections on the evolution of solidarity efforts over time. Thank you.
Thank you, Giada, for your time. If you could go ahead and put yourself on the screen so we can see you as you're answering questions. I'm guessing our audience may have a few questions. You raised some interesting points for discussion. We have about 10 minutes for questions.
Perfect.
Thank you for your presentation. One of the things you talked about was the training of military personnel. I think it was called the School of the Americas. And I'm kind of curious about whether that was something set up just by the Army or if actually people in Congress were aware of it, if they knew about what was going on there. And also what the current status is. I believe it was shut down, but I really don't know the details about that. Thank you.
So my audio is a little faint. Is it possible to repeat the question if it's not a problem?
It was specifically about the School of Americas, I think it was called, by that the U.S. Army had set it up, and I was just wondering if that was decisions made only by the Army or if actually people in Congress were aware of the fact that there was training going on, and also if you could bring us up to date in terms of what I believe it was shut down, but I don't know what the current status of that school is.
Okay, thank you so much for repeating the question. Sorry, my audio is not the best. So yes, that's an interesting question to wonder. As the School of the Americas, it was actually originally established in Panama in 1946, and only in the mid 80s it was later relocated in Fort Benning, I think. And so initially the school was created to provide military training and education also, so for Latin American military personnel. And initially the goal were set to be to promote democratic values, promote military professionalism and respect for human rights among its trainees. Unfortunately, over the decades, the school lens transition and tens of thousands, actually, there were many trainees that attended this particular school, learned more various skills such as counterinsurgency tactics and military leadership. Since the beginning, there was a lot of criticism actually, because not for the school per se, but more for the allegations that many of the graduates of the School of Americas eventually were involved in human rights abuses, torture, extrajudicial killings, and other violations during the Cold War and beyond. And so eventually the school was actually shut down for a while. There were many, many protests, especially in the 1990s, but even in the early 2000s, so not that long ago. And so eventually, I think about 20 years ago, in 2000, perhaps a little more, under pressure from all this criticism, protest, and mobilization, the US Congress actually passed a legislation that required a reform of the school, which now has a different name. It was renamed. And so at current status, it still operates the school. It does provide military education and training to security personnel from across the Western Hemisphere. But of course, it's response to the criticism that it has that was taking place the previous decades have really shaped the core, the value, the missions of this particular military school. So nothing that can be compared to what was happening in the 80s, unfortunately.
Another question here.
Thank you. There's been recent attention given to Vice President Harris's assignment to address some of the root causes of the current immigration situation. And I believe she has spent time in Central America. I don't know if it was specific to Guatemala and or El Salvador, but I wonder if you could comment on the impacts, if any, of that investigation and any changes that have been made to policy as a result.
Okay, so I want to make sure, again, it was about migration from Central Americans and the implication of Vice President Kamala Harris' addresses.
Yeah, it's my understanding that President Biden assigned her to try to investigate and address some of the core causes of the current immigration situation in the countries that the folks are leaving. And I'm wondering if you can address whether that investigation has had any concrete effects. I believe there has been some additional aid earmarked for some of those countries and so forth.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much for the follow-up. I just want to make sure that I hear perfectly well the question. So yes, indeed, it is true. There's been interesting development and approaches, especially from Vice President Harris, to address the root causes of immigration from Central America. And this is, as far as I can see, focused on a very comprehensive strategies that include economic development, anti-corruption measures, violence reduction, and also humanitarian assistance. And this is interesting because it affects the Northern Triangle countries mostly, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. And I haven't really talked about Honduras today also because Honduras didn't go through a civil war as Guatemala, El Salvador, and Nicaragua did. But this call of action is mostly interested in understanding what kind of private investment in Central America can aim to, mobilize resources for economic growth so that it prevents illegal migration. And again, we've seen these incredible and really strong images of these caravans of people walking for weeks, if not months, to cross many borders in order to reach the US, and talk more about how can it be provided, equipment and training to local law enforcement and military forces to combat organized crime, gang violence, which was a big issue in El Salvador. The current administration by Nayib Bukele has been really effective, although with many critics, but it's been effective in curbing the numbers of gang violence, but also the overlapping with drug trafficking. Because again, Northern Triangle is also known to be a corridor for drug trafficking, especially connecting the South to North America. So as far as I understand, one of the most important policy changes and implementation has been the temporary protected status. So for nationals from certain Central American countries, allowing them to live and work in the US at least temporarily, but also strengthening even regional cooperation with Mexico in order to manage migration flows more effectively. So these are some of the discussions that have been seen in terms of how to investigate and address the core causes of immigration from Central America. But I do believe one element that is not overtly discussed is actually how most Central American migrants are also climate change refugees, because the region has been deeply affected by climate change, is extremely vulnerable to droughts, hurricanes, and tornadoes, especially in terms of frequency and violence of the damages. And of course, the civil wars in both countries didn't help. All these bombings, all these scorched earth techniques really affected a lot environmental resources. So many of the refugees that escape today in Central American countries, most do because of poverty and violence, of course, but those are also linked to environmental justice issues. So something that I don't see often at the forefront of debates and discussions.
Thank you so much, Giada, and we look forward. Tomorrow's presentation is dealing with the parallel between El Salvador and some of the water crisis situation in Michigan. And so it'll be interesting to see how you draw parallels between those two situations. Thank you so much, everyone, for participating, and if we could thank Giada again.
It was a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Yeah. This afternoon we have a LESS lecture too, or what used to be called LESS lectures with Terry Schwartz. Environmental lecture, yes. So at 1:30, if you're interested, please come back for that.
Great. Thank you. Have a wonderful day, and I'll see you tomorrow. Goodbye.